as we are getting started, I just wanted to share that one thing to keep in mind as we are, entering this new adventure with Common Core state standards is that IDE secures your sons and daughters and your students a free, appropriate public education and an individualized education plan, and that's not changing. So it's really important to know that in the midst of this change and the implementation of Common Core and standards-based IEPs, that your role on the IEP team is still solid. Your ability to speak to your goals for the future, solid. The whole goal, that foundational goal of why we have special education remains the same, to prepare students to live as most independent as possible, to be ready to pursue additional education, and to be ready to be employed. And those three goals were the goals of IDEA before Common Core. They remain the three goals of IDEA after Common Core, or with it, I should say. So what I'd like to do now is just pass the floor to our speaker this evening, and I just briefly wanted to say how we got connected. So when we first were talking about pulling this forum together, I happened to be at a conference where I met a colleague of our speaker and of Elizabeth, and I shot him an email and I said, we're hearing from a lot of families that there's interest in this, and he happens to work with the Western Regional Resource Center, and Elizabeth's going to share more of that in her presentation about that. But I thought, well, if anyone knows, of a good speaker, that it would be someone from the Western Regional Resource Center. And little did I know, he said, well, we'll come. And I thought, well, that's great. So with no further ado, let me pass the floor to him.
Great, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Great. Thanks for that great start, Roberta. So I look at my goal here tonight is just to give you an overall overview of the Common Core state standards. I don't have all the answers, but I have done a lot of work in this area. In fact, I did a presentation down for the California State Parent Group back in April, down there on the same topic, and I've learned a lot since then. So hopefully I'll be able to answer a lot of your questions. I don't speak for the Oregon Department of Education. I know some of you have questions that only the ODE can answer, and so I'll put up a name and a phone number for the contact at the Oregon Department of Ed that answers questions about opting out of Smarter Balanced or diploma questions, types of diplomas, that sort of thing. So a little bit about myself. I'm a former special education teacher. I spent about 10 years directly teaching in what were called at that time self-contained classrooms, but also in more mixed classrooms as well. And then I spent about 12 years in Iowa as a special education consultant, where we were assigned area school districts, where we helped special education teachers comply with IDEA. We worked on strategies for students with disabilities. I sat in on many, many, many IEP meetings during this time, and I really loved that experience in my life. For about the last 7 years, then, my husband and I moved here from Iowa, and I've been working at the university in a couple of different capacities. First with the Center on Teaching and Learning, doing a lot around early literacy. Some of you may be familiar with CTL. And now I work for what's called the Western Regional Resource Center, and I'll get to that in just a second. We're a federal agency that is supported through the Office of Special Education Programs with the U.S. Department of Education. Okay. And then, perhaps most importantly, I am a family member of a student with a disability. This is my niece that I'm pretty close with in Iowa. And she just graduated from high school at age 21, a Senior Plus program from Valley High in West Des Moines, and was the prom queen. So I had to put up that picture of her. And she just started employment too. So she'd been getting services since she was 3 years old, so things have worked out pretty well, and I'm sure it helps to have an aunt that advocates for you as well. So before I start into this a little bit, I'd like to get a feel for who you are. So if you are a parent of a student with a disability, can you raise your hand? Okay, the majority. Great. And how about special education teachers? Administrators? And then anybody else that would fall in a different category? Where are you? For youth experience and disabilities. Here in Portland? Okay, great. So a little bit about our center is, I don't know if you know this already, but there are many federally funded projects in the U.S. That are supporting every single state, as well as the Pacific MPs, Puerto Rico, Alaska, Hawaii, and so on. And so there are parent centers, obviously. There's parent centers across the United States, with, of course, Oregon's being right here with that. There's also the comprehensive centers, like what used to be called Northwest Labs or Education Northwest. Those are all over the country as well. And then there's also these, what we call regional resource center programs. And you can see that there's six of them across the country. And the goal of these regional resource center programs is we work with state departments of education, specifically with their special ed directors at the state level, and also their staffs to, number one, make sure that they're following compliance, so to speak. Working with them on working with evidence-based strategies, that sort of thing. I just spent a week with Idaho the last few days with their staff, where they're creating a whole new IEP manual at the state level to go along with the Common Core State Standards, which I think is a really cool project. And it incorporates making decisions around accommodations for the Smarter Balanced assessments as well. So that's an exciting project. So we serve actually these 7 states, including Alaska and Hawaii. And then we also serve, this is really, I think, an interesting fact, 6 of the Pacific regions. For example, the Marshall Islands, where I spent a week this summer, Guam, Micronesia, Saipan, and American Samoa as well. So we cover a wide range of areas. And so when I talk here today, I'm not representing the federal level. I did not create the Common Core Standards. We're here to support state departments in their work with students with disabilities around the Common Core Standards. So that's my perspective here today. So what I'd like to do is just start with some of the basics of the Common Core State Standards. Talk about how they relate to students with disabilities. Specifically, I see some really great benefits of the Common Core State Standards, but I also see some real challenges. And overall, I think I'm really pretty neutral on this topic, as you'll see here today. I think that it's a great opportunity for students with disabilities to achieve more than they ever have before. But in order for that to happen, you have to have really good not only special education teachers, but systems that support special education students in classrooms as well. And that, I think, is the biggest challenge. Then we'll talk about ways that we can overcome some of these challenges. Talk a little bit about standards-based IEPs, especially as they relate to the Common Core State Standards. And then finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Common Core State Standards, the assessments that go with the standards themselves. And as I talk here this evening, if you have a question that relates to clarifying something I'm presenting, you're welcome to ask that. If you have more of a question that relates to a specific student or an issue, I'll be glad to stick around afterwards to talk that through with you as well. So if you have a question and you don't want to ask it out loud, there's some sticky notes up there with a pen as well. Okay, so let's talk about some of the basics around the Common Core State Standards. And as Roberta said, we have a whole range here tonight, from No one, I noticed at the survey, no one said that they were at the top as far as their knowledge. I think it was like great or something like it, great knowledge, but most people fell into they know something, or actually they didn't know anything at all. And so we do have a range here tonight. So the what? So the Common Core State Standards, I'll just read what it says up here, and then we'll go back through this definition. It's a coherent progression of learning expectations in two areas: English language arts and mathematics. So they are working on standards in the future for science and social studies, but we haven't seen much about that yet. They are doing some piloting around those, but basically right now it's just English language arts and then mathematics. Designed to prepare K-12 students for college and career success. And so if we take the word coherent, that means that you'll see clearly if you would study the Common Core State Standards that they really are a coherent progression in that if you're missing something like down here, you're going to have trouble moving on to the next skill in math. Or I don't want to say so much reading as well. If you're missing some of those foundational skills, you're going to have trouble comprehending as well. So they all attach to each other from grade to grade to grade to grade. As I talked about English language arts and math, K-12, although I do have colleagues that are working on early childhood standards that are aligned with the Common Core State Standards. So you're even seeing that the standards kind of going down further than kindergarten even, so in our preschool program. So they're ready for kindergarten. Right? And then for college, not only college success, but we know some of our students will go directly to a training program or career. And so we want them to be prepared for that as well. So the goal, if you look at the materials, is to make sure that all students are well prepared for college, a technical program, or the workplace after high school graduation. And what the research was really showing is that, and if you read a lot about what goes on the freshman year of college, that they were saying that what's required at college really didn't match up with how students were ending high school. There was like this huge gap there. And so that's the whole reason, not the whole reason, but one of the major reasons that these Common Core standards were developed is they took they kind of back mapped where they start, what kind of skills do students need to have when they enter college or community college, even the workforce, and then kind of just back step from there. So there's not this huge gap in between high school and college entry. And I wanted to put this up here as well. And this was another reason why we're here tonight, is it's specifically, there's a deep issue when it comes to students with disabilities and moving on from high school. So if you look at these statistics out here, and this is from the U.S. Labor and Statistics website. Across the U.S., 17.8% of working age adults with disabilities were employed, compared with about 64% of people without disabilities. And so that's a problem. We can do much better than that. And we're hoping that one of the ways that we can do that is through these Common Core standards. And then putting it another way, a large proportion of persons with disability, about 8 in 10, were not in the labor force in 2012, compared with about 3 in 10 persons with no disability. Do these numbers surprise anybody, or this is just what you knew already? Okay, so the WHO, almost every state, including Oregon, have adopted the Common Core State Standards. I believe they were adopted by Oregon in 2009, if I'm correct. And so they've been preparing ever since, hopefully. A few of the states did not join. They felt like their standards were higher than the Common Core standards already, and for some political reasons as well. But it's basically just about every state. So who developed the standards? One of the biggest questions I get. So, contrary, there's all these urban myths, I call them, about the Common Core state standards. And one of them is that they're the Obama standards. And that's just simply not the case at all, that these standards were well in development, and there was a strong snowballing effect even before President Obama took office. So this is really a bipartisan effort. It's not the Republicans or the Democrats. I've seen a couple websites that just have a lot of untrue facts to them. That this is really a bipartisan initiative. And they were put together by two main groups. One's called the Council of Chief State School Officers. And basically, this is a group made of the chief education officer in each state, as well as some staff members. Okay. And then the National Governors Association, I'm sure some of you are familiar with that group. Again, it's made up of governors and their staffs. There's an education subcommittee that did a lot of the work on the Common Core state standards. I noticed that Oregon wasn't in that group. They were in, I believe, environmental concerns, that sort of thing, as far as subcommittees. But all of them had to sign off on this. I will say, though, that even though that the federal government did not create these standards, there's kind of some carrots that they introduced for states to adopt the standards. For example, at the time, there were these grants called Race to the Top grants that some of you may have heard about before. And these grants, if you apply for a grant, what you'll see is you get different number of points for different sections that you complete in your application. And I believe it's 40 out of the 200 points were if your state had adopted the Common Core state standards. And so you can see that that was an incentive to receive some additional grant money during that time. Okay? The same way with these state waivers that you had to agree to these standards as well. So there's a little bit of funding attached on the side there for adopting the Common Core standards. So basically I can think of 4 different reasons why these standards came into being. So first would be preparation, and that's kind of what I've talked about already, is that prepare students with the knowledge and skills they need for post-secondary success. Okay? Another one that you heard about or may have heard about is this global competition. Now, because of technology, there's a lot more a globally competitive environment out there where we're really hoping for our U.S. kids to do better than other countries, and you hear about this in the media and so on. So, excuse me. One of the reasons why is to help ensure our students are globally competitive. Another one was equity, which I really like this reason, is that provide consistent expectations for all. So not only between, let's say, a student in Chicago with a student in Houston, but also a gen ed student with special needs, that you're creating consistent expectations no matter where you live, no matter what your disability status, no matter what your language, and so on. So equity is a key word here. And then finally is collaboration. And if you think about, this also has to do with the fact that we're a very mobile society nowadays, and when a student moves from one state to another state, or even from one school in a district to another school within a district, that oftentimes there were different expectations. Oh, thank you. As far as what students were expected to know and be able to do, depending on what school you were in. So this kind of helps even that playing field. But also it helps with resources. So if we all know what the standards are, the idea is that you could work across districts for professional development. You could work across general ed and special ed because you're all working toward the same goals. And so that's where the word collaboration falls in. I want to show you a really, I think it's about a 3-minute video.
Like it or not, life is full of measuring sticks. How smart we are, how fast we are, how well we can, compete. But up until now, it's been pretty hard to tell how well kids are competing in school and how well they're going to do when they get out of school. We like to think that our education system does that, but when it comes to learning what they really need to be successful after graduation, is a girl in your neighborhood being taught as much as her friend over in the next one? Is a graduating senior in, say, St. Louis as prepared to get a job as the graduate in Shanghai? Well, it turns out the answer to both of these questions is no. Because for years, states have been setting different standards for what students should know and be able to do at each grade level. That's making it too hard to know if our kids are really doing well enough overall, and if they can really compete for a job someday. What we really need are clear goals. That's where the Common Core state standards come in. They're like a total sea change in education. Consistent, strong, clear benchmarks for English language arts and math. Here's how it works. You can think of kindergarten through 12th grade like a giant staircase. Each step is a skill your child needs to learn before stepping up to the next one. But right now, too many kids aren't really confident with like 2 plus 2 before they have to move on to 2 times 2. We need more focus on the skills that help them move up the stairs, or they can slip up and fall behind. And there's another problem. What if everyone's stairs were made at different heights? Well, here we go again. They are. So, a boy in Seattle who's rocking an A in English literature could be getting a C on his Chicago friend's staircase. Oops. We need to create consistent steps in education, too. So first, each standard creates a landing on the staircase, a stop along the way as your child heads toward high school graduation. Each stop is a chance for every parent and teacher to focus on the skills their students are supposed to know at that step, no matter the zip code, language, or race. And more importantly, each standard makes sure all students are learning what they need to know to get to graduation and beyond. Because something like counting to 100 leads to understanding dollars and cents, which eventually leads to understanding how to manage a budget. Secondly, the standards are consistent from school to school, and they match up against international standards too. Now we know how we're doing compared to just about everyone. So even though local communities will still design their own curriculum, with the same rules, everybody can compete on the same kind of staircase. But standards aren't learning. That's why we need teachers, parents, and students to help make that happen by working together to help kids meet these standards. The world's getting more and more competitive every day. But now, when our kids get to the top of their staircase, they can have way more options on where their life goes from there. Clear goals, confident, well-prepared students. That's the Common Core state standards.
All right, just any general comments about that? Anything that you learned that you didn't know before? Or? Yes. Okay.
So we have these Common Core state standards. We know that nationally or internationally we're behind other countries. What's the plan to fill the gaps? I mean, we can set those goals and achievements and expectations, but what's in place to address the gaps?
Right. So the idea is that if you have goals that are comparable to other countries, that I mean, that I know what you're getting at here is that you'll see, like with the math standards have truly changed. And for those of you that are in schools already, you'll see that the expectations are much higher now, not only in math, but reading as well. But that's what you're getting at is the dilemma is, it's just because we have higher standards doesn't mean that we're going to have higher outcomes. It's what comes in between that counts. And so it's the professional development that teachers are getting. It's the planning that's going on. It's a lot of other things that are going to have to happen in order to make the goals actually come out as higher outcomes. Yeah, you're right. So I want to just show you, how many of you have ever seen this standard? Some of you haven't, some of you haven't, so I'll just show you. And before you do that, I want to make one other comment about the standards. And this is also something that I've seen information that's simply not true, is that the standards, of course, are these increments or goals that of the knowledge and skills we want students to have at specific grade levels. However, it doesn't tell the teacher how to teach. The standards do not tell teachers how to teach. They get to choose their own materials, just like before. They choose their own methods of instructional delivery. okay? They're expected to use evidence-based practices, which I'll talk about here in just a second, in order to meet those goals. And so all of those are not dictated by the Common Core state standards. It's just the what, not the how, if that makes sense. Okay? It's the what, but not the how you're going to get there. So if you would download the Common Core state standards, and for those of you who don't know this already, I mean, you can just go to the Common Core CCSS, we call it, website, and just look at the standards, okay? And so, in fact, you may want to do that, okay, just to get a feel for what those standards look like. And I'll give you, as parents, I'll give you some other information tonight on, that might help you with. Sometimes you can get a little bit confused with the language of the Common Core standards, so there are materials that are out there for parents for every grade level. Like at kindergarten, what is your student expected to know and be able to do? The National PTA group has great materials out by grade level, and I believe that you can also find them on the Oregon Department of Education website as well, although they're in black and white. But by grade level, what the standards are, but also as parents, what you could do at home to help them achieve those standards as well. But basically, it will list standards by grade level. And there's basically, across reading, there's 10 different what we call core standards. For example, understanding the author's purpose, or reading informational text, that sort of thing. But there's 10 core standards. And for each one of these 10 core standards, you'll find about 3 goals for every grade level, starting in, I believe, kindergarten in math. Well, I should say, and in reading, it's more foundational type skills. Okay. And I can actually show you those in just a little bit. But so basically, they're just listed by grade level, and there are standards for K-3 for what we call traditional fiction text. Okay? There's also a whole new set of different standards for K-5 for informational text. So that would be more nonfiction. Okay? And then there's also Common Core standards for middle school and high school students, not only in language arts, but also what's new with these that people were talking a lot about is there's standards, there's language arts standards in social studies, science, and then what we call technical areas like, let's say, computer classes and that sort of thing. So it's not the content of social studies and science, but what it is teaching students, for example, how texts are arranged in social studies or science, or how to approach teaching vocabulary in social studies and science classes. And I actually think that that's a really good thing for students with special needs, because before it's kind of like they had to just kind of learn that on their own as they approach different types of texts. For example, reading something for fun, like you pick up a book or read at home for just fun, you read that a lot differently if you read a lot differently if that's a social studies text, right? Or a science text. And we do that automatically because we know with those kinds of texts we have to read a lot more slowly, with a lot more detail, that we know that it's arranged in a specific order, where a lot of our kids with special needs don't pick that up. It has to be taught directly, and many times they just don't get that. And so these are the types of standards you'll see at the middle school and high school level as well. So, application for students with disabilities. One of the things I wanted to point out here tonight is that the movement to the Common Core state standards actually coincides with another big movement at the federal level. And it wasn't until I took this job about a year ago, and I've been in special ed my whole career almost, I learned about all the details, all the reports that you need to make at a state level that you present to the federal level. So every state in the United States has to report, in special education, has to report on what we call 20 indicators. each year. So the indicators are things like the number of students who graduate from high school in special education with a regular diploma. Or within a year, how many of special ed students are actually employed out there in the field? Or for our 3rd, 8th, and 11th grade students, how many of them are actually proficient in math or reading on the state assessments? But there's also other things you have to report at. And these are more what we call compliance indicators, like did they test within the 60-day time limit? How many evaluations were late across the state? Or what are some others, Ed? Disproportionality. So are there more students with a certain disability with disabilities in certain categories? Or are there more students from minority groups in special education categories? That sort of thing. And then about 3 months or so after the state turns this information in, they get a report back from the federal government that says they're either in compliance, they need assistance, or one of them is like they greatly need assistance sort of thing. And these indicators and the reports come back have always been based just on the compliance indicators, but never on the results of how students are doing. And so now there's this big change at the federal government where states are now going to be responsible not only for those compliance indicators, but results for students with special needs as well. I think it's a really good thing. And so right now, Sarah Drinkwater, I don't know if you've met Sarah, she's the state director of special education in Oregon. Okay, so she's working, each state has to create a plan for improving the results for kids with disabilities in their state. Okay? And so right now, she and her staff are thinking about what indicators they want to focus on and then how they're going to improve results for students with disabilities across the state. So every state has to do this. So it kind of coincides with results-driven accountability as well, in that we're really looking at better results for kids. It's just not that they have an IEP and that it was done on time, but really, is it doing good? Is it producing better results for kids? And so I think this is a really great thing that's going on. So you'll find many documents on the website for the Common Core State Standards. But this is the only piece of paper, and you can download this from the site, that specifically refers to students with disabilities, okay? And it's called Application to Students with Disabilities. And gee, I don't know if you have this, Roberta, but I have some extra copies here tonight.
And we'll post it on the website.
Okay. And so if you're looking ever for like law that you can refer to, this is the only thing that you'll see that's available. So I'll just read the top part here, and then it will go into this up here. It says, students with disabilities, students eligible under IDEA, must be challenged to excel within the general ed curriculum and be prepared for success in their post-school lives, including college and/or careers. These Common Core standards provide a historic opportunity to improve access to rigorous academic content standards for students with disabilities. The continued development of understanding about research-based instructional practices and a focus on their effective implementation will help improve access to mathematics and English language arts standards for all students, including those with disabilities. Students with disabilities are a heterogeneous group with one common characteristic: the presence of disabling conditions that significantly hinder their ability to benefit from general education. Therefore, how these high standards are taught and assessed is of utmost importance in reaching this diverse group of students. Their instruction must incorporate supports and accommodations, including, so this is directly from this document, supports and related services designed to meet students' unique needs and enable their access to the general education environment. So that's a good thing, but on the other hand, if you read some of the more academic articles about the Common Core State Standards by some of the biggies out there in the research field, they say this is great, But the Common Core State Standards doesn't tell teachers how to do this, okay? So, for example, I'm going to show you in a little bit how text, the complexity of text has really increased with these Common Core standards, but it doesn't tell teachers how they can get their students access to this higher level text. Yes.
Sorry, can I just ask in respect of if they are not giving access to the general education curriculum to a child, are the standards just a standard and not enforced? So as a parent, you wouldn't be able to go down the legal line and saying that they're not providing legally for my child?
Well, that's why I put up the reference to IDEA here, because it's in this document as well.
It's not in state, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
The IDA, so is that the federal or
Yeah.
state,
IDEA
law?
is Individuals Disabilities Education Act. So that's a federal law.
Right. So if I could just jump in, that is in federal law, and what's important to note is the two coming together.
Right.
So Common Core State Standards is this this new statement that's being made that all students should have access to the general education curriculum. What I'd like you to leave with tonight is appreciating that as a parent of a child with an IEP, your student has the right to access to general education curriculum. And what, in the raising of expectations that Elizabeth has mentioned, this is a new expectation for a lot of families. For a lot of families who have students receiving special education, they have questioned whether or not their student was getting access to general ed curriculum. So through advocacy, through understanding your child's rights to a free, appropriate public education, and I'll just throw in, by making sure you really understand your role in the IEP process, you can secure, and this is really kind of cementing that, securing that, and so it's a new direction for us to take.
Okay, the second thing, it states that in, again, this document here, that an IEP should include an IEP that includes annual goals aligned with and chosen to facilitate their attainment of grade level academic standards. And I want to dispel this myth, and I'm going to show you here in just a little bit. It says grade level academic standards, but you can funnel down and look at what we call foundational skills to reach those grade level expectations. And those foundational skills would most likely be the part on the IEP. So don't be scared automatically when you see that it says grade level up there, because the idea is, and I'll show you in my section on standardized IEPs, that you start with a grade level standard, okay? And then you assess, well, where is the student now, okay? And then what is the barrier for them to climb up to the top tier? And your goals focus on those barriers, the skills and the strategies they need in order to meet that goal. So just because it doesn't say, it says grade level, I've heard a lot of people really scared, and some of the questions were about that too, is that it has to be grade level related, but the skills that, it also depends on where the student is at the current time. And I'll show you how you can meld those two. I really like it just because sometimes I think, especially for our students with significant disabilities, you know, when I was a special ed consultant, I was a consultant in a room with students with significant disabilities with the same teacher for over a 3-year period that I was in there. And like no matter what time of the year, or no matter what year I would walk in, she'd still have the same functional activities sitting out for the kids to do. They would have a fork and a spoon, and they would be wrapping them in a napkin. Or they had screws they were putting inside of holes. Well, how does that relate to the general ed curriculum? Okay. Year after year. So that's kind of what we're trying to get rid of, is that we're working on functional skills that the students, and by functional I mean that they relate to a standard that that is meaningful, that they have the right to work on those types of skills just like anybody else. Okay? So And I'll show you that process here in just a little bit, but don't be scared when it says grade level academic standards. And then the third item that it talks about in the application of to students with disabilities, it says that they have a right to teachers and specialized instructional support staff who are prepared and qualified to deliver high quality, evidence-based, individualized instruction and support services. So they need those types of supports in order to be successful with goals and objectives that relate to the CCSS standards. And then there's some other language down here at the bottom. It says, promoting a culture of high expectations for all students is a fundamental goal of the Common Core State Standards. In order to participate with success in the general education curriculum, students with disabilities, as appropriate, may be provided additional supports and services, such as instructional strategies based on principles of universal design for learning, and I'm going to talk about that, what that means here in just a second. I also have a handout here that you can download, and it's called A Parent's Guide to Universal Design for Instruction. The idea with universal design for instruction is this, is that as teachers are planning these lessons around the Common Core standards, that they're thinking not only about just the average student, but the entire range of students in the classroom. Okay? And so they're thinking about, well, who might have, if I present it just orally through a lecture, who might have problems with that, and how else could I get the information to them? Could it be videos? Could it be listening on tape, that sort of thing? Could it be through a lower level text, that sort of thing? And then when Universal Design for Instruction also thinks about, okay, when students have to show the knowledge that they've gained, okay, what are some of the ways that are the options that I can build into my lesson plan to show that knowledge other than a paper and pencil test? So maybe they're giving their answers orally, or maybe they're giving a presentation instead of writing a 2-page paper, that sort of thing. The difference here is that instead of just kind of thinking past the point where you say, oh, well, we have this lesson, now what do we need to do with our students with disabilities? You're thinking about that up front when the lesson is being planned in order to create a lesson that's accessible from the start. You see the difference there? Okay. So Universal Design for Learning has been around for a very long time, but it's coming back now. There's a National Center for Universal Design for Learning that's been funded for many, many years, and people are just starting to pay attention to it now. Technology is a big part of Universal Design for Instruction. So you're thinking from the beginning when you're planning your lessons, how can technology be built in for our students who might have trouble with reading the text? I really want to emphasize this point, that it's different from accommodations and modifications, because you're not waiting to the end and then saying, well, what do we need to do for the student and this student? You're thinking about it up front.
Elizabeth?
Yeah.
If I could just jump in with an example that made itself really available in this room. There was a time when in a room like this, we would only ask, how will we help someone arrive that uses a wheelchair when they got here? But in universal design, and that's when we first started to have the conversation about universal design, was in design of architecture. So this room was designed with forethought that someone might one day need to arrive here that uses a wheelchair. And so there's a ramp on one side and stairs on the other. So be thinking about Common Core State Standards and curriculum development with universal design for learning with that in mind. Educators are thinking about it in the beginning, that my classroom of students all learn differently, that different modalities work. And so this might be scary in the beginning, but has great potential when we adopt this universal design for learning.
I'm wondering what kind of supports and training on the back end that teachers will get to be better prepared to think about universal design from the get-go. Because some of my conversations with teachers, there's like a level of anxiety and stress there of how do I do it. And you know, I know what kind of strategies I use outside of mainstream classroom in my after-school programming, and sometimes that can apply and sometimes it doesn't. So can you speak to that?
Sure, I think it's going to depend on your district. And so I think that some districts probably do a really good job and they've received professional development around universal design for instruction. And then it also depends on like your State Department, what kind of preparation that they might provide for teachers around universal design for instruction. And I'll go back to Idaho again just because that's another state that I'm assigned to. And at the state level, they've brought people in around universal design for instruction, and teachers have had ongoing work in that area. But it's not an easy question to answer, but I will say this. I'm going to put up about 3 different websites where there's tremendous amounts of information, technology tools, how to plan lessons, how to assess kids with other than traditional methods. So hopefully maybe you can bring those out and look at those as well.
Great, but as of now, there's no like standard across the board of, you know, a select number of trainings that teachers will.
No, it's all going to depend on
What's available to you in your local.
I just wanted to support you in a positive way. I'm getting my master's at Concordia right now, and last week, literally Friday night last week, I wrote a paper on UDL, and it was super powerful, and it really just addresses the importance of multiple intelligences, which is how we all think and learn differently. Some of us are visual learners, some of us learn verbally, some of us learn by moving our bodies or engaging in experiments. And it is, throughout all of teaching philosophy and curriculum, it has been addressed, like how people learn differently. It's just the perspectives of how to teach teachers has changed over the last 50 years. And thankfully, that pendulum is now again shifting to the multiple intelligences and seeing that we're all unique learners and that we're all growing. And thankfully, we are therefore being again taught in college and therefore in professional development with people who already are teachers how to address that. But it's still a learning process. But thankfully, things are changing in a really great direction.
And that brought up a comment that Roberta made earlier, remember, and again, it depends on the Institute of Higher Ed. So some colleges make this part of their curriculum, you know, the special ed, and then others not so much. And so, which is unfortunate. Yes.
So this won't be mandated then? In other words, this will be teachers can opt to take a professional day and go get training in this. The new teachers coming through, they're getting it. The teachers who are there now, we've been fighting for multiple modalities for decades. And it's very difficult. Differentiated instruction is incredibly difficult to just throw on a teacher.
Yeah.
And I totally get that. But in the meantime, our kids aren't succeeding. So will this UDL be something that is required for all teachers to partake in and use in their classrooms, or is this just an optional thing? I think that's what she was trying to get at.
It says as appropriate in the language here, and so, I mean, hopefully, most special ed directors are kind of on top of this now. I mean, I don't want to put I don't want to put you on the spot, Ed Jankowski over here, I know from my doctoral program, and he's, I don't know if some of you know him already, but he's the assistant director for special ed for the Portland Public Schools. So do you just want to talk maybe from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. A lot of what drives, I think, the innovation comes from, in our mind, the professional learning communities that teachers will be a part of, where you start with the end in mind, which would be the learning targets, and then you deconstruct those targets, which of course are part of the standards, to activities that students will engage in. And as you had mentioned, Elizabeth, a lot of the assessment that takes place during these activities is monitored, and then teachers can come back and look at, well, what was successful for this student? Which students struggled? What are the adjustments you made? and then you can repeat that kind of cycle of teaching and learning. And as the young lady mentioned who was at Concordia, it's a process, and it is a growing process, and it's not something that happens overnight, but I think the value of that is sharing your ideas within your grade level community, and then also talking about those standards and really how do you get to those learning targets for individual students. And then the piece around special ed is, how does special ed align to that curriculum? How do we support what goes on in the gen ed curriculum? And what skills do we teach outside of that students can generalize in the gen ed curriculum? And Barbara, I don't know if you want to add anything to what I said.
I'm the special ed director in David Douglas, which is a neighboring district here. And I mean, I think we work hard with our teachers to give them lots of professional development opportunities. We do a lot of things around universal design learning, but we don't call it that. So if you went into my district and used that term, the teachers would not know what you're talking about. But we do lots of professional development in their professional learning teams, where they are really looking at what do they want students to learn and how are they going to individualize that so that each student does have that opportunity to learn that skill and that standard. We also do a lot around response to intervention, and the interventions that we use for students is really all about how do we engage students in a whole variety of ways in their learning. So there's a lot of professional development provided through that forum as well.
Yeah, very good. And if your school is using response to intervention, does everybody know what I mean by response to intervention? No? So it's a framework for how you do business in your school, where you're assessing kids, and kids that are at grade level, that's great. They're doing fine with the curriculum, and then there's some kids who are, they receive what's called supplemental instruction, and another word might be a tier 2 student, where they're just getting a little extra in the areas of reading. It depends if you have a math RTI or a reading RTI. And then there's the kids that are in intensive instruction, that not only do they need that core curriculum, but they need a lot of extra individualized support as well. And so it's just a natural part of how instruction takes place in your school. You're not surprised that some kids aren't getting it. You already know from the start that some kids are going to need more than what your typical instruction looks like, and so you have that built in to your system within the school.
Elizabeth, if I could add one thing to address this too, least you leave frustrated. Most of us were parents here tonight. You have such a critical role in the IEP process of being able to share with your team how your child learns in the parent input. And so you don't leave frustrated that your child's in a system that is in the midst of transformation, but become aware of how through the IEP process you can influence the presentation of curriculum for your student right now, present time, through the IEP process. And please contact us if we can be of any support in that.
Another important issue to bring up here when I'm talking about UDL is that UDL often will happen in the gen ed curriculum. So it's just not your special ed teachers, it's your general ed teachers that need to be aware of universal design principles. And then in addition to that, there should be time set aside for the general ed teacher and then the special ed teacher of your student to collaborate and talk about some of these issues when they're planning lessons. And so one of the questions you can ask at the IEP meeting is, do you have time set aside for, my student's general education teacher and special education teacher to talk, to collaborate around lessons that are being taught and preparing ahead of time for some of the UDL, universal design principles. And so that should be a part of your students' program, is that the general education teachers and the special education teachers are no longer separate. They're not separate. They're, especially with these Common Core state standards. I read an article by a couple really kind of famous researchers. They're called the Fuchs, and they're out at Vanderbilt University, and they think that collaboration between gen ed and special ed is going to be one of the key the key areas or the key needs in order for students with special needs to make progress with the Common Core State Standards.
So with all of these various accommodations and models for learning, will the students be able to utilize those, that I was loud enough. Will the students be able to utilize those different modifications in testing
Yes, and I'll get to that
throughout
in just a little bit.
K-12?
Yep. And then there's one other mention in all the Common Core materials besides the sheet that I just showed you here. In the language arts section, it says the standards should also be read as allowing for the widest possible range of students to participate fully from the outset and as permitting appropriate accommodations to ensure maximum participation for students with special needs. And so this is the other reference that's directly in the standards to students with disabilities. Okay, so let's talk for a little bit about what we think are the benefits and challenges to students with disabilities. And so this for me is like the biggest benefit I believe that there is for the Common Core State Standards, and that is that we have higher expectations for all kids, including students with disabilities. And I can show you, I know you don't want to go home and read specific academic journal articles tonight probably before you go to bed, but these are just results from 3 randomly chosen articles that I looked at regarding teacher expectations. And these were some of the conclusions from these 3 different studies. Teachers' expectations had a significant impact on the educational achievement of the students. Low expectations for certain cohorts of students were a major factor in their poor academic achievement. And then another article, students from marginalized groups are more susceptible to teachers' low expectations, and this may serve to further widen the achievement gap. There is a YouTube video that I wanted to show you. We need to expect higher performance, not just for all kids, but I'm talking about for special ed kids. I think there are oftentimes that they can perform so much higher than what our expectations are set. And by the Common Core, implementation of the Common Core Standards, I see that that's one of the major benefits is that we expect kids to achieve these standards. They might not all meet the standards, but that's going to be our goal. So the Pygmalion, in fact, the greater the expectation placed upon children, the better they perform. And another video I was going to show you that I'm not going to show you, but I can give it to Roberta. That would really be good. It's a nice cartoonish type of video about how to approach the student special ed teacher about setting higher expectations. It's kind of like what you were talking about before, that meeting occasionally with the teachers to tell them what your expectations are for your students, because oftentimes, and I'm thinking of the video in my head here, and there's if you know what a high jump bar looks like there, like the teacher is holding down here, but the parent is holding it up here, and she comes and talks to the special ed teacher, and she raises the bar here, so it's even over there. So not being afraid to approach your child's teacher and letting them know what your high expectations are for them. Don't be afraid to do that. In fact, you should do that.
How would you implement that in an IEP? That's my big question.
Higher expectations?
Yeah, because I was told we've got Common Core Standards, and that's, I think my son is capable of higher than that because he has Asperger's. So in some like his math is very high.
Well,
So
let me wait till I get to that little section here in just a little bit, and I'll kind of show you a way to think about that. Okay. Common Core standard aligned with what we call the least dangerous assumption. Assume that students with significant disabilities are competent and able to learn, because to do otherwise would result in harm, such as fewer educational opportunities, inferior literacy instruction, segregated education, and fewer choices as an adult. And I've talked about this, and I still think this is one of the keys here, is that with clear, well-defined content standards, it's possible to better identify appropriate universal design for learning tools. And so you know what the goals are ahead of time. You know what the standards are, and so you should have plenty of time to plan for access to those standards. It's not like you move from one school to another, one classroom to another, where all these different standards or expectations are. We know now, if we look at the standards, what the expectations are, and so we should be able to plan for those. Another potential benefit that I ran across from, and I think that it's certainly true, that parents will have a clear and consistent understanding of what their children are expected to know and be able to do. So these are 3 different sources that you may want to look at. And let's see. So the National PTA group, and if you just Google National PTA Common Core Standards, these will come up. And there they have created a parent's guide to student success. And I just took a snapshot of an example of a 2nd grade. So they have one of these little guides for every grade level. So this guide provides an overview of what your child will learn by the end of 2nd grade in math and English language arts. If they know then, that would be well prepared for 3rd grade. And again, they also include ideas for parents, working with students as well. That could very well be. I changed things at the last minute, so.
We'll attach whatever the most recent.
Yeah, Roberta has my most current PowerPoint, and so she can post that. Yeah, and then this one, I forget what, but they have these parent roadmaps, and this is the Council for what's called Great City Schools. So that's another option. And then this one that I really like, and it's called Engage New York, and it's out of New York. But it also provides the Common Core state standards, but it helps you really understand what the shifts are, what's really different about what the past standards were, and then compared to what these new Common Core standards are.
Are these the 3 resources that you were referring to with my question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
About how teachers are going to gain a better understanding of how they can implement universal.
no, this is just for parents.
Okay.
So, yeah, we're going to come up to that.
What was the 2nd resource?
I believe, and it's been a while since I put this one out here, but it's the Council for Great City Schools. They have documents as well. We're hoping that they'll be better prepared for career and college readiness. And many of you have heard the terms career and college ready, right? And so what does that mean, actually? And if you go around to different places, you'll find different definitions. But this is the definition that's used from the ACT Corporation, which was adopted by the CCSS, or Common Core State Standards Initiative. So they defined it as the acquisition of the knowledge and skills a student needs to enroll and succeed in credit-bearing first-year courses at a post-secondary institution without the need for remediation. However, one of the things that is really important to point out here is that the Common Core state standards are not everything. In that, if you look at them, there are no social-emotional goals. There are no behavioral goals. There are no organizational goals. So you will have goals other than those goals related to the Common Core state standards. And one of the things that I like about this definition of college and career readiness, so you saw the one that was adopted by the Common Core. This one comes from Dr. Dave Conley at the University of Oregon. who I've taken classes from, and he runs an educational policy center at the University of Oregon. And I like the definition that he uses, and I want you to think about this as parents or even as teachers when it comes to when we're looking at college and career readiness. So when we think about the Common Core state standards, oftentimes it's just, this area over here to the left, key content knowledge, like the factual information, which you need to know and be able to do. Okay? But, and even the kind of the cognitive strategies are taught. But for our students or students with disability, don't forget there's a lot of other important skills that students need in order to be college and career ready, other than those that are in the Common Core standards. For example, key learning skills and techniques. So you can see here, time management, okay? Study skills. How do you study for an exam? Okay? Goal setting. Okay? Persistence. You don't just try things once, but you have to keep at something in order to master it. Being able to work with others, collaborative learning. Okay? How do you retain factual information? What are some of the strategies that you can use? Okay? So for those of you that are parents here, would you all agree that sometimes those are just as important as the content themselves? And so don't forget that your IEP may contain college and career readiness goals not related to the content, but the process of how you learn. So that's very important. That has not gone away. Okay? And then key transition knowledge and skills as well. Oftentimes, and I'm sure that you know, they might not have the skills on their own to approach a high school counselor at school, whoever helps them with post-secondary options, like how do you look into college admissions? What's the process for doing that? What's the process for obtaining financial aid? That sort of thing. Agency, a big one there, and that is like, how do I advocate for myself? That's still an important part of goals for our students with disabilities. So we talked about the benefits, and do you want to stand up and take a stretch break for the last 40 minutes? No? Okay, we'll keep going then. So let's look at some of the challenges. So these are the English language arts standards. So if you look at the document that I opened up for you, okay, here are the areas that all have standards in them. Okay? So you can see that foundational reading skills, and I should have had a line drawn there because they only go to 5th grade. Okay? And those are the skills like phonemic awareness, if you've heard about that, phonics, reading fluency, and the thing I want you to remember here is that in the standards, they stop at 5th grade. However, for many of our students, they need to continue to work on these skills past 5th grade because they haven't mastered them yet. So even though, you may have a 7th grader and there's not a 7th grade goal for these foundational skills, that's still not something you need to talk to the teacher about, that they need work in these areas as well. So there's a whole section of goals and standards for reading literature, like I talked about, reading informational texts. You'll find writing standards all the way from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. This is something new. I don't know if you knew this already, but there's standards for speaking and standards for listening comprehension. And then there's standards for language development. Again, all the way from kindergarten through high school. So I put a challenge there that the foundational skills stop at 5th grade. But these are the biggest areas I want you to think about. These are the biggies when it comes to what's changed for students with the Common Core standards. So first of all, there's what we call, and you'll see language around this, a staircase of text complexity. I'm going to show you a slide to show what I mean by that. There's much more informational text. In fact, the authors of the standard said that in elementary school, about 50% of the material that students work on should be fiction, and 50% should be more nonfiction informational text. And then in high school, they recommend that reading skills, that 75% of the text that they encounter be with nonfiction. So in other words, preparing for text that they'll see after high school, that nonfiction text. And then another big area, and if you Google this close reading, you're going to find hundreds and hundreds of results. This is a big term now that's out there for teachers, and something you should be aware of, and it's called close reading. And what close reading means is that it's the idea that students actually interact with the text in a lot more depth than they have in the past. So the first time that the teacher reads, it might just be to get the flow of the text. The second time that they do a reading, they might have a pencil in their hand and they're making notes on the side of the text. So for example, like they might say, well, I wonder why the author said this, or they're circling words that they don't know the meaning for. So we call that text annotation. So this is a big expectation now with close reading. And then the third time they go through it, they start asking questions like really deep questions about why did the author end the story this way? Why do you think that the character did this? Or why do you think the character did that? So they're not simply recall questions at all anymore. I mean, there's a few, but they're really digging into the text. And I think this is going to be really difficult for kids that struggle with reading, but I can see ways that it can be done, starting with the teacher really, really taking time to model these skills over and over and over again. One of the strategies that teachers can use that I've seen used successfully is they take the role of the student and they're modeling what they're thinking in their head. So they're reading a text and they go through here and they say, oh, that word is kingdom, but I'm not quite sure what a kingdom is. So I'm going to circle it and see if I can find something around that word that will help me learn the meaning. So they're saying everything that goes through their head in the role of a student as they go through. They can do that in reading, they can do that with math, they can do that with a lot of content areas. But in order for students to be able to do close reading, again, your special ed teachers or the gen ed teachers are going to have to model, demonstrate, and model before they can expect students to do it on their own. And so that's one of the, I think that the more you know, and just, I know this as a special ed teacher, the more that you know and the more good questions that you ask at your IEP meetings or other times, the more that they're going to be aware that you know this strategy and you expect them to use it, your teachers, and so just kind of bringing those things up at the meeting is going to help you out a lot. That, how much modeling has been done for this particular skill? Are they working with peer partners to help them work through some of these skills? That sort of thing. So, and another term, a hot term that's out there is scaffolding. And that what I was just demonstrating to you is scaffolding. I don't expect them to do that on their own. I'm helping them get there. That's called direct instruction. That I'm directly teaching them and modeling and demonstrating the skills that I expect to be exhibited in the classroom. So here's an example of how much harder that the texts are expected to be in schools with these standards. And this comes from a woman named Elfrida Hebert, who is a really big name in literacy down in San Francisco. What she did was she took the text of typical texts in classrooms over the last couple years, and then she looked at texts that are recommended by the Common Core state standards and looked at comparing the difficulty levels. Okay? And a word there that you may want to become familiar with is lexile. And it used to be when you and I were growing up, we used grade levels. Like if you look on the back of a book, it might say 1.5, that this book was at a first grade, 5th month level. Okay? Some books are still like that, but more often than not, they're moving to these, what we call these lexile ranges. And it has to, a computer actually figures out these lexile ranges. And it has to do with the number of difficult words that you'll find in the text, how long the sentences are in the text, and so on. And so a computer figures these out. And there's typical lexile ranges for each grade. So in the gray there is the old lexile ranges, which for second grade and third grade ran from about 450 to 725. But when they look at the books that are recommended, and schools don't have to use these books, they're just recommended books that cover the skills that they want to teach. Okay? So those new lexile ranges range from 450 to 790. So you can see the overlap of the black there, and that's how much more difficult the text will typically be now in the classroom with this new standard. So you'll see a little bit of difference going on down, except when it gets to that high school level. And how many of you have students currently in high school? Few of you. Right. What do you notice down there at the 9th and 10th and even the 11th grade level? Yeah, there's hardly any overlap. That the texts are going to be much more difficult for those students. And so what you want to make sure that you do as parents is ask the question to the teachers, how will my student get access to those materials? Will it be available orally through technology where it looks like books on tape? It's not tape anymore. It's old-fashioned, but books via technology. Yeah, like, okay. Or well, they were working in a small group and they might have peers having read the materials out loud. Or will they get access to the same content materials but maybe through videos, that sort of thing. Remember when I talked about universal design for learning? Right, so you're thinking ahead of time, well, this is the difficulty level of the text that I expect students to read. Now, most kids should be able to read that, but I know there's going to be students that don't have that ability, so what am I going to do to make sure they get the information? So the key word to use there is access. How can my child get access to that information? And then, as I mentioned before, just be aware that there are standards now, and there's going to be reading and writing skills that are taught in these areas. It's just not about the content anymore. It's how do I read text in this area, and then what are some ways that I write in the social studies area. And just for your information, high school teachers have resisted this for years and years because they feel like they're the content expert and that's what they want to teach is the content. But now they're forced to teach how to read and write in those content areas because they're part of the Common Core State Standards. You're shaking your head here, the Special Ed Director for David Douglas. You've seen that as well. Yes.
Yes. High school teachers are definitely think they're content driven. My son is a high school science teacher.
Okay.
Even him was like
First-hand knowledge. Yeah. So it says right here again in the standards that they need to be given support needed to enable them to read at grade level appropriate level of complexity. So they need support. There's also writing standards, which is, I think, a good thing because grading has been ignored for so long. I believe, that's my own personal opinion, but it's been ignored for a really long time in the schools, and I think one of the reasons it's not been tested, when we look at state exams, it's not been tested very often, and so therefore it's kind of been left to the wayside. And actually, there's a couple of researchers out of they were at Vanderbilt, now they're from Arizona. And I've gotten to know them through a couple of conferences that I've put on. Steve Graham and Karen Harris, like their names. And they did a large-scale study to look at actually how much time teachers actually spend teaching writing in the schools. Okay? And it's typically, well, one study came up with actually 8 minutes a day of actually teaching them how to write, and that students generally spend about 20 minutes a day in instruction and actually writing themselves. And so the Common Core state standards, I think, will be very difficult. They'll be difficult for students, but I also think that it's going to be really difficult for teachers to teach how to write, because typically they haven't received a whole lot of professional development in that area. It's usually been, math and reading literacy, but not necessarily the writing. So there is a lot of, if you look at the standards, there's a lot of emphasis starting in kindergarten on how to write an argument, like tell your side of view or your opinion on something. So that's a big theme you see all throughout the standards. And then there's also a lot of focus on being able to do research and show that through writing. But I want to point out that this is an area that has been researched for 25 years. And there's some strategies called self-regulated strategies development by these two authors that I just talked about. They have over 25 years of research that these strategies help students with disabilities improve their writing skills tremendously. Okay? And so it's called self-regulated strategies development. Ask your teachers if they've ever heard of self-regulated strategies development. And if you want to see what this looks like, it's basically, it's teachers teaching students like how to follow a sequence no matter what type of writing they're asked to do. Okay? How to, little checklists that are provided for them. They actually have books out too that directly teach teachers what to say and what to do when they're teaching these strategies. And if you want to see what they look like, there's a center called the IRIS Center, IRIS, at Vanderbilt University, where you can actually see some videos of a teacher teaching these writing strategies to their students. So the point is, there's things out there to help kids. You just have to have teachers that are aware of them and have the skills to teach them. Okay, quickly turning to mathematics. So this is what we call the scope and sequence, or the Common Core State Standards in math. And you can see that, like, for example, the bottom there, geometry, they build on each other all the way from kindergarten all the way through high school. So you can look at grade 7 and you can see what are the big areas that they're going to focus on. So big changes or challenges in math is that you'll see in the standards there's a lot about something we call the language of math. And that's having students not only give the answer, but explain how they got it. So students that have some difficulties with language development, maybe students with autism or just language delays, this is going to be pretty difficult for them. And so thinking about supports that can help them out in that area. So, or provide evidence for that you got the right answer. That's the type of language you see around these math standards. So you have to create and be able to come up with arguments. That's kind of the same thing. You'll see that in a lot of the standards, create viable arguments for answers, like how you got it and why you believe it's correct. And then we call procedural skill proficiency is kind of assumed. And what we mean by that is like multiplication facts, addition, subtraction. It's expected that kids can do that automatically. And so if they can't, then that has to be a skill that they're working. So I kind of put down here my thoughts here is that the real challenge for students with disabilities is not so much, to me, it's not so much that there's these new Common Core standards. But the Common Core standards, you can see, don't equal all students leaving school, college, and career ready. What really is going to matter is what's in this box, and that is access to the materials, access to text, differentiation of instruction in a gen ed classroom with support for special education. And then the other big thing is something we call evidence-based practices. And for those of you that are parents, you've heard the term evidence-based practices, right? Do you really know what that means is the question, okay? So evidence-based practices means this. It's strategies that they've done research around with what we call random control studies, where they randomly chose students for this group, they randomly chose students for this group. One of them got the intervention, one of them didn't. And the intervention that they got, they produced greater results than this group. And it's been duplicated through different research studies. So when you hear the term evidence-based practice, it means that it's just not somebody's opinion that this is going to work. It's been shown through research studies that this particular strategies work for particular groups of students. That's evidence-based practices. And I like this quote that I put in here through this woman, Martha Thurlow, and she testified before the U.S. Senate. And I like this statement here, and I think it tells a lot about the standards. They do not guarantee improved results or increased access and instruction. It assumes that assessments and accountability promote interventions and improvements in the quality of instruction, which in turn will produce higher performance. And just as somebody stated, I believe it was you at the beginning, that it's just not, the standards aren't going to produce higher outcomes. It's what the teachers do inside the classroom, along with you, with your support, that's going to make the difference. I'm going to skip over a couple slides because I really want to get to some of the key things here. Universal design for instruction. Ask your teachers, your school, if they've provided professional development around this area. And I really like this cartoon. It's not a cartoon, but it's a comic up here, and it gets to the idea of universal design for instruction. So you can see there's a boy in a wheelchair. He says, "Could you please shovel the ramp?" And he says, "All these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then I will clear the ramp for you." And then he says, "But if you shovel the ramp, we can all do it." And it's like, it's the whole idea of creating access from the beginning rather than waiting until, everybody else is in, and then we're going to think about how to get you in, that sort of thing. So I really like that idea. This is a slide that I had referred to earlier. So if you go to these websites, you can learn a lot more about universal design for instruction. The last one down here has a tremendous amount of technology tools that can help students access the general ed curriculum. So that's one that you for sure may want to look at. I wanted to get to the sections on standardized IEPs, because that's a concern that a lot of people hear, that the questions they wrote. So what is a standards-based IEP? It's an IEP that is framed by your state standards, or in this case, Common Core state standards, and contains annual goals aligned with and chosen to facilitate the student's achievement of state grade level academic standards. And surprisingly, some of you may not know that standards-based IEPs have been required, although it's not done in all schools. It's been required for over 10 years. And so with the reauthorization of IDEA, it states right in the material, right in the legislation, that you should have standards-based IEPs. So they should be aligned with the standards for all kids. So this is nothing new. It's just that there's new language within the Common Core standards that says IEP goals must be aligned with the Common Core state standards. And so it's not new. It's just being emphasized more. So the real issue is how to meld special education's promise of individualized instruction with the Common Core standards. And so a quick way of showing this is that typically in the past for IEP meetings, usually before you got there, the teacher and the staff would have assessed your student. Then you would have determined what their needs are and wrote the plan, and then you developed their goals. So the difference now is that you're going to start with a standard in mind. So it's expected that all teachers are pretty familiar with the Common Core state standards, including special education teachers, because they should be receiving professional development along with their along with their general ed teachers, all along there. So they should know what the standards are. So you start with the standard, assess where the student is functioning with regard to the standard, determine disability-related needs that provide success, what skills are they missing that prevent them from getting to the big goal, and then develop your annual goals after that. So I wanted to demonstrate this with, before I do that, standards-based IEPs are not intended to cover every possible educational goal for the student. We only pick what are called the biggies. So, again, there are no social emotional goals, behavioral goals. All of those you'll still need to add, that sort of thing. And then you're going to pick what we call the biggies. And so, I know this looks really complicated, but this was the best explanation of how you could go about thinking about this. And I'm going to read a little bit from this article and then kind of think about this along the way. It says, it is helpful to think about climbing a mountain as an analogy for establishing proficiency with foundational skills for a specific Common Core standard. A Common Core cluster lies at the top of the mountain. So you can see that if I looked in my math standards on the Common Core standards, if I opened up that document at the 3rd grade level, okay, and that's why it says 3, and the NBT stands for it's numbers in base 10. So that's one of the standards that students will learn how to add and subtract with base 10 numbers. And it says this, use place value understanding and properties of operations to perform multi-digit arithmetic. So that's the biggie up at the top. Standards fall below the cluster so that when the foundational skills are integrated, they lead to mastery of the cluster. As students hike up the mountain and reach a series of base camps, which are their foundational skills, they gain the skills and supplies necessary to reach the mountaintop with success. And so the idea here is that, if I open again the Common Core State Standards for 3rd grade, I would see this as a big goal, use place value. But then right underneath there, they have these little sub-goals. And that's what you see in the green. So number-based operations. Under that, they have 3 areas. Multiply 1-digit whole numbers by multiples of 10. That's what you expect of a 3rd grader by the time they leave. Another sub-goal, fluently add and subtract within 1,000, and then use place value to round whole numbers to the nearest 10 or 100. So your student or your child may not be ready for that yet. So then what you can do is you can look at the next grade level back and say, okay, so they're not ready for that. So what are the skills they need in order to meet that goal? So let's say use place value to round whole numbers to the nearest 10 or 100. Well, maybe they're not able to do that yet. So a teacher should be very proficient, and they've studied the Common Core where they can look back now. So they look at a 2nd grade standard under numbers of base 10. Understand place value. And another one they'll find at a 1st grade level is extend the counting sequence past 20. And if they can't get that, then they look at the next grade down to see what are the skills that the student needs in order to meet the extend the counting sequence. So can you see how you keep backing up? So this is the grade level standard. But then I'm going to look at the child and what they can do at the present time. And you're going to figure out where on that mountain they are. And those become your IEP goals. I'm not saying this is easy, but I want you to think about it as a framework for thinking, that you're always backing up. We call these little white boxes the foundational skills. And you'll find a lot of discussion out there where it says, when foundational skills are not established, students will continue to struggle with mathematics and not meet the Common Core standards. And so you're still working on a grade level expectation. but you're working from where they currently are. So this is meaningful up here because it's a grade level standard. But at the same time, I'm meeting their individualized needs because I'm backing up through the standards to come up with where they are now. So maybe they're working on adding and subtracting with 20 where we want the goal of fluently add and subtract with 1,000 by the end of the year. But again, on this one, you can see how I've backed up through the standards. Does that help you kind of think through how it's possible to do that?
My son got his school report and they gave him 4, 3, 2, 1 and there were the numbers on how he was achieving. Does that relate to this or is that something to
I'm going to say that's something totally different.
Right,
but
okay.
I don't know. Some schools are creating newish type report cards with the standards on them. You're shaking your head. Yeah.
We're doing that in our elementary schools, and I think some of the Portland elementary schools are too. So they're standards-based report cards. So they really are then rating whether the child met that standard or demonstrated that they could do that or not.
Yeah, that's what
That's what you
I'm comparing this to what we just got
Okay.
today.
Yeah, so you can kind of make the connection, hopefully, now, of what you're seeing in the report card to this up here. Somebody else have a question?
I do. My question is, because most of the IEPs are written for on a yearly basis, is there a way that the parent can actually get a listing for each year so that you can kind of plan for, my kid needs to know this, and at the end of the year, this is where they're at and this is where they need to be for next year, to kind of anticipate IEP meetings as far as developing the goals?
Yeah, you can hold an IEP meeting whenever you want.
No, I'm asking where would we get the literature that says what our kid is supposed to know at each point?
Yeah. Either you can go and download the standards, but I said that's pretty thick reading, and you may not want to do that. But I listed 3 other resources for parents by grade level. Like if you go to the National PTA website, and you can download by grade level what a student's expected to know and be able to do based on these standards by the end of each grade year. A little bit about the Smarter Balance. Obviously, Oregon is a member of the Smarter Balance Consortium. These are and we're running out of time here, but these are skills that are assessed in each area with the Smarter Balance. The Smarter Balance is aligned with the Common Core state standards. And I want to explain the kind of tests that Smarter Balance does. So typically, when you take a test, a student starts at the beginning and they have to answer every question until they get to the end, right? Well, with Smarter Balance, actually the first year, and I'm not sure about Oregon, but I know that other places across the country, they're offering it by pencil paper the first year or computer. And then after that, I believe it's just computer-based only. Yeah. And so they use a different method of testing called curriculum adaptive testing. So based upon a student's grade level, they'll start them out where they think they could typically answer a question correctly. So all kids start with, like, let's say a 3rd grader. Okay? They would start at a 4th question in a sequence of questions in a topic area. If they get that question correct, the computer automatically goes higher and asks them a more difficult question. Okay? If they get it wrong, then they'll go back to an easier question. So you're constantly kind of going back and forth. The same way here, if they got that first one wrong, then they're going to ask an easier question. If they got that wrong again, they'll probably back up. If they got it right, then they move forward. So the idea is that instead of going all the way through, it's kind of like you're going like this. So you finally come to a spot where the computer estimates where that student's skill level is. If any of you have ever taken like a some types of tests like the GRE or graduate record exam or other tests. Trying to think of any other tests you might have taken where it's computer adaptive testing. So no student will typically answer all questions unless they get everyone correct, but it's the idea that they're estimating where you are, that sort of thing. So no, your student will most likely not have to answer all questions on that assessment. That's the difference with Smarter Balance. So I just wanted to show you some typical items, and if you're interested, even if you want to help, you can go in there with your child, and you can actually take a practice test on Smarter Balance right now. So it's open to anybody where you can go there and take Smarter Balance. I just pulled a few of the questions off the practice test just to show you what they would typically look like. So somewhat just like tests of the past, like a multiple choice type question. So there's a story that they read, and then here's the question. Coyotes plan to get the honey veil. Support the statement with 2 details from the passage. Because if you look at the Common Core state standards, one of the standards is that you'd be able to provide details to support an answer. So this aligns right with it. What's different is they're going to have to type in that box there. But I'll talk about accommodations here in a second. So that's a little bit different. There's also a lot of application of skills, and so 4 families bring chairs to Mr. Smith's party. Each family brings the same number of chairs. 3 more chairs are needed to seat all 27 guests. Drag the number of chairs one family brings to the party. Jared kind of looking at division skills here and other skills. So not only do they have to come up with the answer, but they have to demonstrate or apply it. There are what we call a lot of embedded accommodations, and this is one example where the calculator is already embedded into the test. So they don't have a separate calculator. They can just use the one that's already built in through technology. And then there's these performance tasks, which measure a student's ability to integrate knowledge and skills. And so it's a whole class activity where an example is that one of them that I read is called the lemonade stand. I believe it's at a 3rd grade level, where she reads a scenario out loud about you're selling lemonade, and how would you keep track of the number of cups of lemonade that you sold through a graph or through markings. And so a child has to show how they would keep track. Would they keep track like with tally marks or a graph where they would fill in each time they sold one, but some method of keeping track of things that have been sold. So, and then they get a certain amount of time to do that in the classroom. So they write just on a piece of paper. And then I believe that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but some of them with these open responses are then sent in for others to grade, not people within the district. Okay, and so the last thing I'd like to leave with as far as the assessment is that I would recommend that you, and this is something I think, Roberta, you would want to provide on your website, that the Smarter Balance Consortium has this handout that you can download. And it's called Usability, Accessibility, and Accommodation Guidelines. And the big thing about this is, as I'll finish my last couple of slides here, is that a state can only make available to students the universal tools, designated supports, and accommodations that are included in here when they take the Smarter Balance. And so teachers have to be very aware of what's in here. And then it also says in here that they may approve temporary approvals for accommodations that aren't in here, but then they have to send that into the Smarter Balance company. But the thing I wanted to get at is that it also talks in here about how the school has to let the parents know like what accommodations are available in the Common Core, through Smarter Balanced. And so they should be informing you of what's in here. And very quickly, this is kind of difficult to understand, but there's 3 different levels of accommodations in Smarter Balance, the tests that the students will take. One is called Universal Tools, and these are available to everybody. It's just that the teacher or the school decides which ones they're going to make available to students. So usually that's made at a school level. And there's embedded and what we call non-embedded. Embedded means that it's already built into the software. It's just that the teacher will have a computer that controls everything, so she can set whatever embedded accommodations that she wants for kids. So she could set it for everybody, or she could only set it for students, specific students. Okay, it's very high-tech type of assessment. And so you can see what some of the embedded assessments are that anybody can use. Like an English dictionary, students can use a highlighter if they want to highlight certain sentences in text. There's a spell checker. And then non-embedded means it's not within the technology, but the teachers can use these if they want. For example, giving breaks in between tests, scratch paper, having a thesaurus available, and so on. Then there's what they call the designated supports. And I look at this sort of like as available not only to special ed students, but I think about English language learners, as this is an area that they maybe will fall in. Especially, it doesn't say it on here, but there is some translated text with different languages in there to make it more accessible to students who have English as a second language. Okay. And then there's the non-embedded here, or bilingual dictionary, that you can make that available. And then the accommodations are just for students who are on an IEP. So they can have all the universal, they can have the designated supports, but then these are also possible accommodations that you would want to discuss during an IEP meeting. So there's embedded sign language inside the tests, which I think is a cool thing. There's Braille, there's closed captioning. There's also text-to-speech, during math problems, right? And you can turn on the text-to-speech to have those read out loud, that sort of thing. And then non-embedded would be alternate response options. And so, for example, do you remember where I said a student had to type in the details of a passage? One option would be if that's difficult for students, if they have a writing problem, that they could dictate those out loud. But then again, these are things that you would discuss at the IEP meeting. Having a read aloud, scribe, text-to-speech, and so on. The thing is that I want you to remember that, I also want teachers to remember, is that you can't decide to use these like the day before the test, because you have to know how to your students have to know how to use these tools. Because the teacher's not going to be standing there helping them use the tools. It's expected that they know how to use these tools. So for example, an embedded calculator, you would want practice with that ahead of time. Highlighting as a means of helping you, remember key ideas or details. They need to know, how can a highlighter help me? Okay? And then how do I use the highlighter in this particular assessment? So, if your IEP doesn't fall real close to the testing window, that's another thing I would do, is come in and meet with the teacher to talk about some of these accommodations, and especially around Smarter Balance, that you can't do this a day ahead of time. It has to be very well thought out. So make sure that you get a hold of this. So this will explain these in a lot more detail than I have time to tonight.
What's the name of that document again?
It's called Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium, Usability, Accessibility, and Accommodation Guidelines.
I will definitely have all of this posted. Loretta, our information specialist, has made it her goal that when you go to our website, you'll be able to easily find Common Core material on that. So,
The only other thing that I would like to say is the ODE person again, his name is Derek, D-E-R-E-K, Brown, and he can answer specific questions from an Oregon Department of Education perspective.
super. So thank you, Elizabeth. And Elizabeth has agreed to just stay up here and answer some specific questions that you might have with regard to the Common Core. I also want to let you know that there are some fact staff, myself included, that will be available over here, where if you have specific IEP questions with regard to this, we'd be happy to discuss that with you as well. And I started in the very beginning of the beginning of the evening by talking about what changes and what doesn't change with the implementation of Common Core. And I wanted to end with this too. Your understanding of the IEP is absolutely critical. And FACT has an IEP training that's now available 24/7 at your convenience, available on our website. We also have trainings across the state that we set up. But understanding where these two worlds meet is going to be key. So in that present level section in the introduction of the IEP, that's when you're going to set that bar and you're going to share with the team your high expectations for your child. Absent that, there's no vision, there's no expectation. So right off the bat, you've got a critically important role. I think Elizabeth made it really clear that introducing your students to technology is going to be key, because it's going to now be very integral in how they're assessed. So making sure to introduce that is something that you'd like to see goals on. Not at 7th grade, not at 10th grade, I'm talking about kindergarten. When are we introducing keyboarding? When are we going to be introducing text-to-speech, some of the different softwares that are available? That's all going to be super important. And then the last thing I wanted to just say is understanding those accommodations. When I mentioned earlier that you know your child best, it's going to be really critically important that you go to that IEP prepared to share with the team what accommodations work for your sons and daughters, so that you can make sure that they're then included in there, and that you and the team are aware on whether or not they're going to be the accommodations that support your student during assessment time. You don't want to support your student with accommodations and then find at assessment time that those accommodations aren't accessible during the assessment. So you've got a critically important role. And I think coming and understanding the Common Core tonight is a great first step. So thank you, Elizabeth. If you have questions specific to Common Core, please come see Elizabeth. And if you have just some general IEP questions, FACT staff will be over here.
I have some general questions in general. If the child is not reading at the 3rd grade level by 3rd grade, are they retained? They're not retained?
No.
Okay.
Assessments and retention would not be related. I think the thing that would be important to remember is how Elizabeth introduced the idea that the standards, I think you used the term backing up. So from wherever the standard is, you're going to back up. So I'm thinking of someone who, may if for our intents and purposes might be just working on functional skills right now. The standards, there's a place in the standards for a student who we don't currently think is being introduced to academics. So there is nobody who can get left out of the standards. You just back up to where you're going to start your journey up that mountain, as Elizabeth had said.
Or additional supports available to special ed students that have a huge gap. So because of the historic issue around education. So for example, a 9th grade student reading at a 4th grade level or at a 4th grade math level, because even in setting those goals, from the way that we've learned today, the gap is so huge. Are there additional supports through the district?
That's going to vary district to district, but what I can tell you is that with the governor's initiative on education and the 40-40-20 goal towards increasing diploma acquisition, and with your advocacy arriving there saying we're going to shoot for a diploma, and it looks like we've got some work to do. So team, let's rally the troops because we've got to put some things in place. The first thing that happens to make that happen is you saying, I've got a vision for my child, and it's going to be to get a diploma. And then the supports are possible. The IEP drives services. So if the team sets goals in place that require supports, modifications, and accommodations, then the team's going to identify what those might look like. And they might, I'm being a little simple in how I respond because there's also a response to intervention, RTI that was mentioned earlier, and some other different strategies. And all different schools have other different strategies. So I can't put a cap on what those supports might be, but the team can identify what they are.
So am I understanding you to say that even with the gap that large, the strategies and tools are within the schools and school districts to mitigate that gap?
I think that with the diploma options that are available, the IEP team needs to think big and out of the box. And yes, if I could be so bold, hopefully I'm not being too bold, but I truly do believe, I've met families that when their student was 17, they believed that their child was not going to be able to get a diploma. And when the parent became aware that the child was not tracking for a diploma and said, wait a minute, we've got a vision and it includes a diploma, the team rallied the troops, put things in order, identified what was going to be the most appropriate diploma and made things happen. But the first thing that happened was a parent saying, I want my son or daughter to get a diploma. Stephanie?
I guess I'm still not hearing how Common Core levels the playing field. It still sounds like having an advocate shouldn't be a prerequisite to being successful in school. I'm still hearing that the playing field is not being leveled, that there's still going to be disproportionality, that you have to know, there's plenty of parents that know their rights and go and advocate for higher expectations, and they're not respected, but that shouldn't be a prerequisite to success in special education. So I'm not hearing where the playing field is leveled.
I think they use the term level playing field because it's like everyone is expected to meet the same goals, the same standards, and that expectations are not different for a non-special ed versus a special ed. We're all expected to achieve the Common Core state standards.
I think high expectations is where I go, Stephanie, when I think about the level playing field. If for time immemorial we've had certain groups of students that we segregated, and by that segregation stopped holding them accountable for academic growth, we now have leveled the field in the sense that all students are now going to be held accountable, which we didn't really get a chance to go into it much. But the whole idea of, some families had concerns on why would I even have my child take assessments. And the idea is that by the expectation that all students will be assessed, we're able to say all students are making progress. Are we all catching up to grade level immediately? No. But we should be able to see trends of all students making progress up that mountain.
Well, sort of my big issue is I love the Common Core standards. I think, thank goodness, it's here. And the testing, it's all great. My big problem is back to what she had said about how we get there. The curriculum, the evidence-based curriculum that the SPED teachers are using, and even the gen ed teachers who've come out of college, in the last 10 years, is not working for most of the children. The reading programs, teaching reading almost doesn't happen anymore. You are told to provide rich literature for your child. I had 2 administrators, one principal and another assistant principal, say to me, all a child needs to read is the library and rich literature. Honestly, so many people believe this. 80% of children in special ed are dyslexic. And they are there because the gen ed teachers are not teaching the foundation, the cook, act, cat. They are teaching, here's the picture of the cat, here's the word. You need to memorize the whole word. Sure, that works for about 40% of the kids. But the other 60%, some need some instruction, some need really intense instruction. Dyslexia is a spectrum, just like autism. We have lost so many in the last 20 years of these kids to underemployment because they have not reached the literacy level that they could have reached. Had they been taught that foundational, the phonemic awareness, the rules of the English language? They're good at vocabulary. They're good at grammar. We have missed the foundation. So when I see you doing the math thing and you're going back to that foundation, I said, oh, I wish it was a reading thing. Because it would have been, here's the word, and you go back to, here are the sounds, here's the 6-syllable division. How many people know the 33 rules of the English language? I'm telling you, my students are teaching the teachers because they weren't trained, and it's not necessarily their fault, but when we go in as parents and say to the SPED teacher, my child needs to have one of the 5 programs that is sequential and cumulative and works for these kids, and then the answer is, I can go to Goodwill and get some phonics books. I'm sorry, this is not cutting it. That's my concern. I think this stuff is fantastic, but we need to get behind and supporting the teachers and teaching instruction, which she's going through. This is fantastic. To get them to do the differentiated instruction, to have the tool in their toolbox, which they do not have. So we've lost a generation.
I can't fix that globally, but you have my word that one by one by one, parents going in, and it does not level the field, Stephanie. It requires advocacy. I can't address that concern, but advocacy one-on-one, can address that.
To that, I think that it really depends on the district and the school that you're in, because some districts and schools are doing a fantastic job with response to intervention, with helping kids. Others maybe not so much. But as a parent, if I were you, I'd really pay attention to the progress monitoring data that
Sure,
special ed, because teachers are they're obligated. If something's not working, then you have to try something else. So that might be an avenue, like the progress monitoring data. Sure.
Didn't help with my child, but where I'm advocating for other children. I've seen hundreds of them go through the system being given the same Dibbles tests or not given the proper progress monitoring. So that's where I really want some change to come. Using these as our goal.
Thank you, everyone. And again, we're going to be off mic, but we're available if you've got some closing questions.